The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in plastic. Laura Bennett punched her time card at 6:08 a.m., the clock's mechanical click swallowed by the deeper rhythm of the ICU. Ventilators wheezed, monitors beeped their steady percussion, and somewhere down the hall a patient's call bell chimed without urgency. She had been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of 12-hour doubles, 3 years of moving through Sacred Heart's corridors like a ghost in Scrubs, 3 years of being invisible to everyone who mattered. The antiseptic smell hit her first, then the cold. The ICU held its temperature at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, protocol for the machines, not the patients, and the stainless steel railings of the beds felt like ice under her palms. Laura hung her jacket on the back of the supply closet door, the movement practiced and economical. She had learned long ago not to waste motion on anything that didn't matter. Her hands were scarred. The surgical lights caught the white tissue that webbed across her knuckles and climbed toward her wrists, stories written in healed wounds. Nobody asked about them. Nobody asked about anything. In the ICU hierarchy, nurses occupied a particular nowhere, trusted with lives but never consulted about them, present but not heard, competent but never quite credible. Laura had made peace with this arrangement 3 years ago, and she had stayed exactly as long as it took to keep that peace unbroken. She moved through the morning briefing with the other nursing staff, listening as the night shift reported on the 6 patients currently in beds. Room 4 was a post-op cardiac patient, stable. Room 2 was a sepsis case on broad-spectrum antibiotics, holding steady. Room 6 was the difficult one, a trauma admission from late last night, subdural hematoma, still waiting on neuro's final assessment. The night nurse reported his name, Marcus Wolf. Navy training accident, they said. Something about a helicopter insertion gone wrong. The name moved through Laura like a current of electricity, but her face remained still. She had trained her expression to be a flat surface, a mirror that reflected nothing back. She wrote the name down in her notebook with the same attention she gave to every other patient name, every other vital sign, every other piece of information that constituted a life reduced to data points. Room 6 was at the end of the corridor. Laura carried the morning vitals cart with both hands, the plastic containers rattling softly with syringes and tape and the small instruments of her trade. She had learned to move quietly. Her boots, regulation hospital issue, grey and worn at the heel, made no sound on the tile floor. The rhythm of her footsteps could be measured like a heartbeat, 1, 2, 3, 4, reaching toward the room where something inside her had stopped breathing. She saw him before she fully entered the space. Saw the shape of him in the bed, the bandages wrapped around his head like a crown of gauze, the way his chest moved with the rhythm of the ventilator. Saw the stitched lines of his face, younger than she remembered, or perhaps just emptier. The traumatic brain injury had done that, stolen the light from behind his eyes and left only the animal reflex of a body still learning how to stay alive. Then she saw the tattoo. It was on his forearm, the inside of his left wrist, positioned so only someone standing close would notice it. A call sign. Her call sign. The name they had given her in Ramadi 7 years ago, before everything changed, before the operation went sideways and Washington needed plausible deniability, before naval intelligence had erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Bennett from the official record and ordered her to disappear into civilian life and never resurface. The call sign was inked in bold black letters across the soft inside of his arm, and below it was a date, 2017. Laura stood in the doorway and felt the world shift in a way that had nothing to do with the ICU's climate control. Marcus Wolf had been a junior petty officer then, the kind of kid who followed orders without asking questions and trusted the people above him to make decisions that mattered. She had carried him through enemy fire once, his body limp across her shoulders, one hand pressed against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. She had dragged him to the medevac with 10 minutes to spare, and that was the last time she had seen him alive. The boots caught her eye next. They were on the window ledge, placed with the precision of a memorial. Combat boots, worn and sand-stained, with the laces still threaded through the eyelets. She knew those boots. She had left them behind in Ramadi when she carried him to the helicopter. They were the only physical artifact she had kept from her former life, the only thing she had allowed herself to carry into the civilian world. They had been buried in a cardboard box at the bottom of her apartment closet for 7 years, and she had no idea how they had made their way to this hospital in Houston. She checked his vitals with a professional's precision. Blood pressure 128/71, heart rate 82, oxygen saturation 96%, temperature 37.1 Celsius. Everything stable. Everything normal. Everything arranged in the orderly progression of a body that was still fighting to stay in the world. His pupils were sluggish but reactive. His hands, when she checked for reflexes, twitched in response to stimuli. The traumatic brain injury had not been catastrophic, not yet, but the swelling on the MRI was significant, and his Glasgow Coma Scale score was a 7, which meant his brain was not processing the world the way a brain was supposed to. She pulled up the chart on the computer terminal at the foot of his bed. The admitting notes were sparse: Navy training accident, 02 for 7 hours, medevac by Night Stalker helicopter, JSOC direct authorization for hospital transfer. That last detail made her breath catch. JSOC involvement meant someone knew who he was. Someone knew that this patient carried classified weight. How is he? The voice came from behind her, carrying the particular authority of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy space. Laura turned and saw him for the first time, Dr. Richard Hargrove, Chief of Surgery, standing in the doorway with a tablet in one hand and an expression that suggested he was already calculating how this patient's presence would affect his quarterly metrics. He was tall, with the kind of posture that suggested military background, though his hands were unmarred and his shoes cost more than Laura made in a week. He was wearing a suit under his white coat, something most doctors didn't bother with at 6:57 in the morning. Stable vitals, Laura said. Responding to stimuli. No acute changes since night shift report. Hargrove moved past her without acknowledgement and began his own examination, his movements sharp and efficient. He checked the pupil response, reviewed the chart, examined the wound site with the detached gaze of a man looking at a statistical problem rather than a human being. His jaw tightened slightly as he read through the neuro notes, and Laura watched as some internal calculation took place behind his eyes. "What's his prognosis?" she asked, keeping her voice level and deferential. Just a nurse asking a doctor. Nothing more. Uncertain, Hargrove said, still reading. Depends on the trajectory of the swelling. If it stabilizes in the next 48 hours, we might see meaningful recovery. If it continues. He trailed off, leaving the alternative unspoken. His ex-military. Training accident, Laura said. That's all the chart says. Well. Hargrove looked up from the tablet, and his eyes moved from the patient to the window ledge where the boot Saturday. We'll see what the next 72 hours bring. The hospital's mortality statistics in the ICU are holding at 8.2%. I intend to keep them that way. He paused, and something in his expression shifted into something harder, something that reminded Laura of the weight of institutional power being measured. Make sure his care is by the book. No improvisation. No heroics. If he deteriorates, we follow protocol. He left without waiting for a response, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a man who had never had to listen to anyone speak. Laura stood in the silence he left behind and placed one hand on the chrome railing of the bed. Marcus Wolf's chest continued its mechanical rise and fall, the ventilator doing the work his own lungs could not manage. She looked at the boots again. Then at the tattoo on his arm. Then at the monitor displaying his heart rate, steady and strong, a rhythm that insisted on continuing despite everything working against it. I need some jello, she whispered to the empty room. Then she turned and walked back into the ICU, where the fluorescent lights hummed their metallic song and the other nurses moved through their routines without knowing that something had fundamentally changed in the space of a single patient name. Morning rounds began at 6:15, when the ICU was still half asleep and the night shift was counting down their final minutes. Laura stood at the foot of Marcus Wolf's bed with her tablet, her vital summary ready, while the team filtered in around her, residents in white coats, a respiratory therapist, the night charge nurse, and Wolf's sister standing rigid in the corner with her arms crossed. Dr. Richard Hargrove entered last, moving through the room like air pressure changing before a storm. He was 43, with a kind of tailored precision that came from money 3 generations deep, cufflinks that probably cost more than Laura's monthly car payment, hair that never moved, a Patek Philippe watch that made time look expensive. He'd been chief of surgery for 7 years and had not lost a patient to infection or surgical error once in that span, a record he mentioned in board meetings the way other men mentioned their golf handicaps. Laura opened her mouth. Overnight he showed increased accessory muscle use. Breath sounds diminished on the left. I'm concerned about. His imaging is stable. Hargrove didn't look at her. He looked at the family. The CT from yesterday showed no change. Contusions are resolving normally. We monitor, we wait, we let the brain do what it does. But his oxygenation curve is within acceptable parameters for post-traumatic cerebral edema. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority, each word placed like a brick. What we don't do is chase phantom deterioration based on subjective nursing observation. The resident wrote something. The respiratory therapist suddenly became very interested in the ventilator settings. I've been tracking it for 3 days, Laura said. Her voice stayed level. No tremor. No heat. The pattern suggests. What I suggest, Ms. Bennett, is that you remember your role. Hargrove turned to face her then, and his smile was the kind that predators use before striking. This man needs a surgeon, not a nurse playing hero. The last thing he needs is emotional attachment clouding clinical judgment. His family came here for medical expertise, not sentiment. The sister's face went white. Laura didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply breathed in through her nose, held it for a count of 4, and breathed out. 1 tear escaped. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without looking away from his face, and when she spoke, each word landed like a round into a silent room. I've been written up by better men than you, doctor, and they're all dead now. She set her tablet on the bed rail and turned to the monitors, checking the line of the EKG, the steady pulse of the oxygen saturation, the numbers that told her everything Hargrove's expertise refused to acknowledge. Behind her, she heard the resident's pen stop. Heard the respiratory therapist's breath catch. Heard Wolf's sister whisper something to her husband that sounded like a curse. Hargrove left without another word. His shoes clicked on the tile in a rhythm that sounded like consequences. By 7 o'clock, Laura was in the break room making coffee, her hands moving with a kind of automatic precision that came from 1,000 morning shifts. The room was full, 2 nurses from the night shift, a resident, someone from transport. The moment she pulled out a chair, they moved. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But one by one they remembered things they had to do. A chart they needed to review. A message they'd forgotten to relay. A supply run. Within 90 seconds, she was alone with a cup of coffee that was still steaming, sitting in a room that suddenly smelled like abandonment. She didn't touch the coffee. She sat with her hands folded on the table and stared at nothing, understanding perfectly what this silence meant. Hargrove had a voice that traveled. Hargrove had a reputation that made people cautious. Hargrove had the ability to tank someone's career with a phone call to a friend on the board, and everyone in this hospital knew it. By 8 o'clock, she found the write-up on the unit bulletin board, printed on official hospital letterhead and posted where everyone would see it. Performance documentation. Employee, Laura Bennett, RN. Date, today's date. Chief of Surgery, Dr. Richard Hargrove. Documented issue, inappropriate emotional attachment to patients. Clinical decision-making compromised by subjective concern rather than evidence-based practice. Insubordination during rounds. Failure to accept medical direction from attending physician. Recommended action, mandatory counseling. Reassessment of ICU placement. Signature, Dr. Richard Hargrove. Her eye scanned the words twice. The paper felt thin in her fingers, the kind of thin that made it easy to fold, to hide, to pretend she hadn't read the careful arrangement of phrases that were designed to look clinical but read like a knife wrapped in procedure. 1 tear ran down her cheek. She let it fall. Then she wiped her face and walked to the ICU, where she found Hargrove reviewing a chart in the hallway outside Wolf's room. Dr. Hargrove. He looked up, and something in his expression shifted. He'd expected her to be broken. He'd been counting on it. "I wanted to thank you for the documentation," Laura said. Her voice came out steady, measured, the voice of someone who had already survived worse. "It's detailed. Clear. Very professional." His jaw tightened. "And I want you to know that I read every word." She stepped closer, and something in her posture changed, just a degree or two, a shift in weight distribution that made her presence take up more space. "That man in room for 12 has been to Ramadi. He's been to Helmand. He's survived things that would end most people permanently. His brain is bruised, but his body is strong. Your feelings about this patient aren't relevant." Her eyes met his and held. "But my training is. My observation is. And my commitment to his recovery will not change based on your performance review or your phone calls to board members or your network of colleagues who might be eager to help you bury something you're uncomfortable with." Hargrove's face went red, a slow, creeping flush that started at his collar and worked its way upward. "You're out of line," he said. "No, doctor." She turned away. "I know exactly where the line is. And I'm not crossing it. I'm just refusing to apologize for standing on it." She walked back into the ICU, where the monitors beeped their mechanical rhythms and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Wolf's eyes were still closed, his ventilator still doing the work that his lungs couldn't manage yet. She checked his peripheral lines, his catheter placement, the position of his head to prevent aspiration. She didn't know that Hargrove was in the hallway making phone calls. She didn't know that within the next 48 hours, he would contact board members he'd helped elect, residents he'd trained, surgeons he'd mentored, a network of obligation and favor that spread across Houston's medical infrastructure like a web. She didn't know that he would be reaching out to her listed references, asking carefully clinical questions designed to undermine her judgment. She didn't know that he was about to bring in an outside investigator. But what she did know was that the silence around her had a weight now. That her colleagues were avoiding her like a contagion. That Hargrove had started a clock she couldn't see and wouldn't understand until it ran down to zero. At 2:13 a.m., that clock reached its chime. At 2:14 a.m., the cardiac monitor above Marcus Wolf's bed began to sing a different song. The heart rate climbed. Climbed hard. 120. 132. 148. The rhythm on the screen shifted, electrical alternans, the EKG showing the distinctive alternating pattern, the waveforms tall short like a metronome designed by someone who understood that symmetry dies when a heart is drowning in its own fluid. Laura was reviewing labs 3 feet away when she heard it. Not the beeping. She'd learned to filter the beeping months ago. She heard the asterisk change asterisk, the subtle acoustic shift that happens when a machine moves from monitoring to warning. Her head lifted. Eyes on the screen. O2 sat 94. Good. But the blood pressure had started slipping. 116/73. Then 108/68. The pressure was falling like a slow elevator with a cut cable, and the jugular veins above Wolf's collarbone had begun to distend, swelling visibly against his neck like he was being throttled from the inside. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, suffocating it. The kind of emergency that kills you if you don't act. The kind that doesn't send an announcement. It just arrives and starts closing your options one by one. Laura moved. Not fast. Controlled. She reached for her pager and walked into the hallway, maintaining calm the way a person maintains their balance on a collapsing dock, knowing that panic makes gravity worse. The on-call surgeon was supposed to be Dr. Patterson. 31-year-old guy, solid skills, came from Johns Hopkins with a reputation for staying composed when things went sideways. Laura paged him. Waited 17 seconds. Then her pager buzzed. The response was a callback number she didn't recognize. She dialed it. The voice that answered wasn't Patterson's. "This is Dr. Hargrove." The words landed in her stomach like a dropped instrument tray. She steadied her voice. "Attending to a SEAL patient in ICU or 4. Cardiac tamponade presentation. Vitals unstable. Needs surgical consult at the bedside. Now." Silence. Not the kind of silence that means someone is thinking. The kind that means someone is calculating. "Comfort care." His voice came through like a pronouncement from something higher than a man. "Move him to palliative protocols. Contact the family. His pressure is dropping. He's in active decompensation." Exactly. Which is why aggressive intervention would be inhumane at this point. "He's terminal, Bennett. Let him go." The line went dead. Hargrove arrived at ICU for at 2:38 a.m., moving through the unit like a man walking through a building he owned. He didn't look at Wolf. Didn't examine the monitor. Didn't review the most recent labs or the imaging that had been taken that afternoon showing no significant pericardial effusion. He just looked at Laura with the expression of a man reviewing an inconvenience. "I'm implementing DNR status as of this moment. No code, no defibrillation, no invasive procedures. Do you understand? His presentation indicates reversible shock. Fluid in the pericardium. One procedure? I don't need a nurse's diagnosis. I need you to follow my orders. Is that clear?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked back out into the hallway, and that was when Laura realized what was actually happening. This wasn't about Wolf anymore. This was about the board review scheduled for Thursday. This was about the chief of surgery's pristine mortality statistics and a patient whose unexpected recovery would be worse for his career than a patient who died predictably. This was about leverage and optics and the way some men use institutional authority the way other men use fists. Hargrove's phone came out before he reached the nurse's station. She could see him through the glass, not looking at the phone, but at the nurses, at the clock, at the architecture of an opportunity. The first call took 3 minutes. Then another. By 3:15 a.m., his voice echoed through the ICU hallway in that particular tone of a man calling in debts. "Richard Hargrove, Houston Sacred Heart. I need your signature on a comfort care consult recommendation. No, it doesn't need to be in person. 30 seconds, really. Just confirms what we've already established clinically. Pause. I know you remember. Referred 3 residents to you in 2019. Helped when the board was asking questions about that malpractice insurance spike. Pause. Great. I'll email the paperwork. 24 hours on documentation, perfect." The second call was similar. Then the third. Then the fourth. By 4:07 a.m., Hargrove had contacted someone named Chen at UT Southwestern, someone named Marchand at Baylor, someone named Kowalski at the VA, names that meant nothing to Laura except they were names of people who suddenly owed something to a man in a tailored coat standing in a hospital hallway at an hour when normal people were sleeping. By 6:13 a.m., the consultation report had begun to materialize. Not through clinical judgment. Through obligation. Through the careful architecture of institutional memory, who had helped whom, who had recommended whose brother for a fellowship, whose research had been cited in whose paper, whose divorce had been handled quietly by whose friend at the firm. 20 doctors. That's what the report showed when it arrived as a PDF in Hargrove's inbox. 20 separate clinical signatures, each one representing a favor that had been called in, a debt that had been collected, a person who had made the choice that it was easier to sign a recommendation for comfort care than to question the man who had built their career. The report landed on Laura's desk at 6:41 a.m. She read it standing up. 20 signatures. All recommending cessation of aggressive treatment. All recommending that Marcus Wolf be allowed to die. The room around her didn't go quiet. The room was already quiet. 3 nurses at the station. 2 residents reviewing charts. 1 respiratory therapist checking ventilator settings on a patient 2 rooms down. None of them looked at her. They'd learned not to look at her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove wasn't finished. By 7:20 a.m., he'd already contacted the hospital ethics committee and scheduled an emergency phone conference. By 7:52 a.m., he'd called in an outside investigator from the state medical board, anonymous complaint, he'd said, about a nurse demonstrating signs of inappropriate emotional attachment and possible clinical judgment impairment. By 8:19 a.m., he'd begun calling the 3 professional references Laura had listed on her hire paperwork from Sacred Heart 3 years ago, the ones she'd spent 18 months carefully selecting, the ones who knew nothing about her work history before that, the ones who could only speak to what she'd done here, in Houston, under a name that wasn't the one she'd been born with. Laura watched it happen. She stood at Wolf's bedside and watched the institutional machinery begin to turn, the way it turns when someone with authority decides that a particular person has stopped being useful. The ethics committee call scheduled for 9 a.m. The state investigator asking for personnel files. The references receiving calls asking whether Laura had ever displayed signs of unstable judgment or boundary violations in the workplace. At 8:43 a.m., Wolf's blood pressure dropped to 92/56. The monitors showed his heart working harder and harder for less and less return. The body was starting to fail. Not because he was terminal. Because the fluid around his heart was suffocating him, compressing each beat, making every pulse work against a force it couldn't overcome. The jugular veins distended further, thick and prominent against his neck like cables under tension. At 8:51 a.m., his pressure dropped again. 84/48. By 9:04 a.m., it was down to 62/39. Laura looked at the numbers and she looked at the monitor and she looked at a man who had carried her through enemy fire, who had made it back from Ramadi still breathing, who had spent the last 7 years of his life walking through the world with her call sign etched into his skin, and she made a choice that moved her past the boundary of following orders and into the territory of deciding what she could live with. She moved to Wolf's bedside. Checked his for access. Found the 14 gauge that had been placed in his left antecubital fossa. Gathered what she needed, a spinal needle, an 18 ml syringe, antiseptic, a towel to catch what came out. The room around her changed. The nurses at the station kept their heads down. The residents looked at their charts harder. Even the machine seemed to quiet, the way animals quiet when they sense something large moving through the space. She cleaned the skin over the 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line. Her hands were steady. Muscle memory that had nothing to do with 3 years as a civilian nurse. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. She advanced it slowly, feeling for the give, the moment when the needle would break through the pericardial membrane and enter the space where the heart was drowning. There. That slight resistance shifting into release. She advanced the catheter and withdrew the needle. Connected the syringe and began to pull. The fluid came back dark. Dark red. 200 milliliters of blood that had been compressing his heart instead of flowing through his veins. She drew it slowly, steadily, feeling the pressure change in the room with each cc that came free. O2 sat was 88. It began to rise. 89. 91. 94. 97. Stable. The blood pressure monitor beside her began to climb. 70. 80. 91. One of the residents had stood up. She was staring at Laura's hands, at the way the procedure had been executed with a kind of precision that didn't come from 3 years of clinical experience. Her eyes moved up to Laura's face, then down to her wrists, to the small dark line of a scar visible just above her left wristband, thin and old and wrong for a nurse who'd worked only 3 years. That was when the security guards walked through the door. The spinal needle slid between Wolf's ribs with the precision of muscle memory. Laura's hands moved on their own, guided by 17 years of training that had nothing to do with a nursing degree. The needle found the pericardial sac. She drew back on the syringe. 200 cc of blood emerged, dark and urgent, pooling into the barrel. His pressure climbed immediately. 60 to 70. 70 to 85. 88. Stable. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm and she exhaled, her breath finally matching the ventilator's cadence. Sinus rhythm. The room went dead silent. Behind the glass, Dr. Hargrove stood motionless, his phone still pressed to his ear. His face had gone the color of drywall. On the other side of the locked door, she could see him watching her, and for exactly 3 seconds, nothing moved. No one breathed. Then his jaw tightened and he spoke into the phone with a voice like an engine shifting into a lower gear. "Get security. Now." Laura didn't look at him. She was already turning back to Wolf, already checking the needle's placement, already making sure the blood draw site wouldn't leak. Her movements were economical, precise. A nurse would have been shaking. A nurse would have been terrified. But Laura Bennett had carried wounded men through crossfire in Ramadi. She had held compression bandages while rounds snapped overhead. She had decided a long time ago that fear was just another data point, and right now her patient was breathing and his heart was beating, and that was all that mattered. The door hit the frame so hard the glass rattled. "Step away from the patient," Hargrove's voice came through the intercom, amplified and hollow. Laura finished securing the fall line. She did not step away. She did not turn around. She felt rather than saw the security guards entering behind her, 2 of them with the heavy stance of men trained in restraint. One of them was Martinez, who'd escorted her to 3 different meetings with her dying husband and had never once made her feel rushed. Martinez said quietly, "I'm sorry. I have to ask you to come with me." She turned then, and her eyes met his for just long enough to nod. She understood what was happening. She had known it the moment she locked the door. You didn't go against a chief of surgery who'd spent 20 years building institutional authority. You didn't perform an emergency procedure without written orders. You didn't challenge the network he'd spent 6 hours assembling, 20 doctors whose names were on that comfort care recommendation, each one of them willing to let a man die rather than question Hargrove's judgment. You didn't survive that kind of defiance in a hospital where the administrator owned the board owned the credentials committee, and the credentials committee owned your future. Laura extended her wrists. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound like a final punctuation mark. Martinez looked genuinely pained, but his hands were steady and his voice was steady and he was doing his job. She could respect that. She had been the person who did the job even when the job felt wrong, because following orders meant you didn't have to examine your conscience, and examining your conscience was a luxury soldiers didn't have the currency to afford. They walked through the ICU. Every nurse who saw them came to a complete stop. Some looked away. Some watched openly. One of them, the resident who'd glimpsed the scar on Laura's wrist, had her hand over her mouth. No one moved to help. No one spoke. In the hallway, Wolf's family stood in a cluster near the waiting room. A woman who had to be his ex-wife made a sound like she'd been struck. A girl, maybe 12, looked at Laura with an expression that would stay with her for the rest of her life, confusion and betrayal and the beginning of understanding that the world didn't work the way children believed it did. Laura didn't look back. The front desk took her badge in a manila envelope. No ceremony. No final check of her locker. Just a signed form that said she was terminated for gross violation of protocol, insubordination, and inappropriate emotional attachment to a patient. Her name was already being processed out of the system. By tomorrow, her employee ID wouldn't work on any of the doors. By next week, her name would be flagged if she tried to apply anywhere in Texas. The evening came cold and thin, and she drove to the cemetery because there was nowhere else to go. Tom had been buried near the southern edge, under an oak tree that had probably been there longer than the hospital. Laura knelt in the wet grass, the rain coming down in sheets now, the kind of rain that made you question whether the sky would ever remember how to stop. The headstone was simple because they'd never had money for anything else. Thomas Bennett. Beloved husband. Here lies a man who kept his promises. He had kept them. He'd promised to wait while she was classified. He'd promised to raise their daughter who'd been 6 when Laura disappeared, who was 12 now and had a stepmother and a new last name and a life that didn't include a ghost of a woman in scrubs. He'd promised to love her even when he didn't understand what she'd done, where she'd been, why she couldn't talk about any of it. And he'd kept those promises for 8 years until the cancer came, and he kept them for another 18 months while it took him apart cell by cell. And then he'd left her alone. "I couldn't save this one either, Tom," she whispered. Rain ran down her face and she didn't wipe it away because there was no one here to see weakness, and soldiers didn't cry but they wept, and there was a difference. "I finally found him. After 17 years, I finally found him. And I still failed." The rain hammered against the stone. The wind moved through the oak tree like something with intelligence, with purpose, with the cold authority of an ending. She pressed her forehead against the wet granite and let herself break just enough to remember what it felt like. Not much. Never much. Just enough to know she was still human, and then the moment passed and her hand steadied and her breathing normalized and she was back to being whatever she'd become. By midnight, Laura was sitting in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot with a cardboard box on the passenger seat. Everything she owned at the hospital, her spare stethoscope, a photograph from her nursing school graduation, a coffee mug that said coffee, and scrubs that Tom had given her 3 years ago, fit into that single box. She sat there in the dark and counted her cash. $217. Her last paycheck had bounced because Hargrove had flagged her termination as disciplinary, which meant they could withhold final payment pending investigation. She had no health insurance as of 0600 hours this morning. No job prospects. No identity that existed in any official capacity except the fake one that Tom had helped her build 17 years ago, the one that said Laura Bennett was a civilian with no military background, no family, no history that mattered. Rain drummed the roof of her car. She looked at the cardboard box and then at the combat boots that were somehow still in her locker after 17 years, dusty, cracked, the leather mold to the shape of feet that had walked through a city that no longer existed in any legal geography. She picked them up with both hands. For a moment, she held them over the window, ready to let them fall into the parking lot and disappear forever. Let it all go. Let Wolf go. Let Tom go. Let the idea that she could still be useful, still matter, still save anyone go. The boots felt like weight. Like consequence. Like the only proof that she'd ever been anything more than a nurse in Houston. She set them carefully back in the box. And that was when she heard it, distant at first, almost a vibration rather than a sound. The thud of rotor blades cutting through rain-thick air. Laura looked up through the windshield at the dark sky and watched as a single navigation light emerged from the clouds above Sacred Heart's helipad. Then another. Then a third. She'd heard that sound before. She'd called for it before. She'd trained to recognize it the way most people recognized their own heartbeat. 3 Black Hawks. For the first time in 17 years, someone was coming to find her. The rotor wash hit the hospital parking lot like a physical force, and Laura stood motionless beside the cardboard box containing her entire career, 3 years of badges, commendations she didn't dare frame, the contents of her locker arranged in manila and plastic. The 3 Black Hawks descended on Sacred Heart's helipad in perfect formation, their blades pushing rain sideways across the building, and she didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched. The ER doors burst open. 12 personnel in full tactical gear flooded through admitting, and they moved like apex predators that had crossed oceans on a mission, mud still clinging to their boots, plates visible under their kit, the kind of men who didn't ask permission. The lead operator approached the triage desk with the presence of a man accustomed to having questions answered before he asked them. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Where is she? The room contracted. The night nurse stared. A security guard's hand went to his radio but froze there because something in the way that man had spoken her rank, her actual rank, the one that had been scrubbed from every hospital record, changed the atmospheric pressure in the entire ICU. Laura didn't move. The cardboard box was still in her hands. Rain dripped from her hair. That's her, the operator said, pointing. The one with the box. She should have felt relief. Instead she felt vertigo, 17 years of concrete identity collapsing in 4.2 seconds. The SEAL team didn't rush toward her. They turned as one unit and moved toward the trauma bay where Wolf was still sedated, his blood pressure finally stable at 118/76, the tamponade drained and his chest rising and falling on the ventilator's rhythm like a man given back his breathing. Hargrove emerged from the back corridor still in his $14,000 suit, and his face underwent a transformation, confusion, then calculation, then something worse, recognition that the ground beneath his authority had become quicksand. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The 20 doctors who had signed the comfort care recommendation 12 hours ago were suddenly very interested in their charts. Marcus Wolf's 12-year-old daughter stood in the middle of the ICU with her mother's hand on her shoulder. She stepped forward with her phone trembling in both hands, reading from the screen in the voice of someone reciting scripture at a funeral, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Just that. Just those words. Her voice cracked. You're a Senior Chief Petty Officer. Laura felt the box in her hands become weightless. A nurse she had trained for 8 months, Sarah Chen, the same nurse who had left the break room the moment Laura sat down 3 weeks ago, came through the trauma bay doors with a classified file folder pressed against her chest, and she was crying. Not the professional tears of someone moved by a patient's recovery. The breakdown of recognition. Navy Cross, Sarah whispered, pulling papers from the helicopter commander's hands. Purple Heart. Her voice fractured. You have a Navy Cross. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in the silence that followed. A 3-star admiral in dress blues emerged from Trauma Bay 3, and the room simply stood down. Not because of his rank, though that existed in abundance around his uniform, but because of how he moved through the space like a man accustomed to having oceans part. His eyes found Laura once and held her there, and he approached with a kind of deliberate pace that made Hargrove step backward involuntarily. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of official record, Silver Star for Valor in Ramadi. He paused. One beat. The room breathed that in. Distinguished Service Medal. Another beat. And a presidential commendation for a classified mission that officially never happened. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. His hands moved toward his phone like they were someone else's hands. When his vitals crashed at 0300, the SEAL team leader said, Senior Chief Wolf triggered his dead man switch. The operator was looking at Laura directly now, and there was something in his expression that resembled respect. Automatic alert to JSOC. Told us her location was compromised. Told us she might need extraction. She saved his life, the Admiral said. The statement was not up for discussion. It was record. 12 doctors said comfort care. 48 hours of systematic pressure. Senior Chief Bennett refused all of it. The Admiral looked at Hargrove now. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis in a locked ICU room while you were assembling a consensus against her. Against him. Against someone who had already given more than any of you ever will. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old linoleum. The SEAL team leader stepped directly in front of the Chief of Surgery, and the distance between them suddenly felt like the distance between two men who understood power in completely different ways. One earned it through knife work and doctrine. The other thought it came with a title and a position on the hospital board. You ordered her removed while she was saving an operator's life, the SEAL team leader said. His voice was conversational. This was the worst thing. Not rage. Conversation. You called her colleagues to undermine her. You brought in external investigators to humiliate her. You created a file on this woman's alleged misconduct while your patient coded twice because you cared more about your statistics than his survival. Hargrove stepped backward. His hand found the wall. Then security arrived, the same guard who had escorted Laura from the hospital with her cardboard box 12 hours ago. He approached Hargrove with another box in his hands, this one containing the chief's badge, his credentials, his hospital-issued phone. The guard delivered the line with visible satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching hierarchy crumble in real time. I believe you know the way out, sir. Hargrove didn't move. Didn't take the box. He just stared at it like it contained evidence of something he couldn't undo. The SEAL team leader took the box from the guard and held it out, not offering it, just presenting it the way you'd present a man with his reckoning. "You have 15 minutes to gather your personal items from your office," the admiral said. "After that, federal agents will secure your files and computer. Your medical license is under review by the state board effective immediately. The nurse you fired gets her position back with a formal hospital apology, back pay for the hours you instructed HR to withhold, and the assurance that Sacred Heart will be implementing a whistleblower protection protocol that will make what happened here impossible to repeat." Hargrove's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then rang. The admiral didn't look at him. He didn't have to. The man who had built his reputation on maintaining Sacred Heart's mortality statistics was watching his reputation vaporize in real time, and everyone in that ICU was watching him watch it happen. Laura set down the cardboard box. Slowly. She didn't say anything. She just straightened, and the fluorescent lights overhead caught something, a change in her posture, in the way her shoulders aligned over her spine, in the way she looked at Hargrove with the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. She walked to Trauma Bay 3 where Marcus Wolfe lay sleeping, his blood pressure stable, his oxygen saturation at 98%. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm like a promise being kept. The admiral followed her in and stepped aside, giving her the bed. Laura reached down and took Wolfe's hand. His hand was warm. Real. Alive in a way it hadn't been 6 hours ago. His fingers were calloused in all the familiar places, trigger finger, magazine changes, rappel work, and she held them like they were evidence that she hadn't failed, that she had carried him to safety once again, that the boots sitting on his ICU window ledge in the pale Houston dawn meant something. "He'll remember you when he wakes," the admiral said. "Memory consolidation is already starting. The brain trauma was severe, but your intervention stopped the secondary cascade. You bought him time for his neural tissue to heal." The admiral paused. "You were trained to carry people through fire. Looks like some habits don't retire." Laura didn't respond. She was thinking about Tom. About standing at his grave in the rain and telling him she had failed. About how she had spent 17 years believing she was just a nurse in an ICU, that the woman she had been before was gone, that the uniform she had buried with him couldn't be resurrected by circumstance. She was wrong about all of it. 6 months later, Wolfe stood on the stage of a veteran rehabilitation center in Houston, wearing his dress blues and those same worn combat boots, the ones Laura had placed on his ICU window ledge every single day he lay unconscious. His daughter presented him with his reinstatement papers. His mother wept. The room applauded. Laura stood in the audience in her own dress blues, her uniform tailored and pressed, her silver star pendant catching the light. She wasn't there as his nurse. She was there as his senior chief. The distinction mattered. The distinction changed everything. He recognized her face as he stepped off the stage. Not from the traumatic brain injury, which had healed completely, but from the tattoo on his own forearm, her call sign, Reaper, inscribed there like a blood oath. He walked toward her through the crowd, and he stopped short of touching her, because some kinds of respect don't require contact. "You brought me out of Ramadi," he said. His voice was steady. His hand rested on the boots he was still wearing. "You brought me out of the dark just now." Laura met his eyes. "That's the job," she said. Then and now. The hospital board voted the following Tuesday to implement comprehensive whistleblower protection protocols and to establish a 12-bed Navy SEAL and veteran trauma wing with Laura as the director of nursing care. They offered her the chief nursing officer position. She declined. She wanted to be in the ICU. She wanted her hands on the patients. Some people are built for titles. She was built for work. 2 weeks after that, Hargrove took a job teaching CPR certification classes at Houston Community College for minimum wage. His name tag read Steve. He flinched when patients called him doctor. One of his students was a young woman in Army combat uniform, home on medical leave, and when she recognized him from news coverage of the Wolfe case, she reported him to the college administration for credibility reasons. He was fired 43 days into the position. Laura never heard about it. She was too busy rebuilding the systems that had nearly killed a patient she loved. She was too busy training nurses in how to recognize the difference between protocol and cruelty. She was too busy being what she had always been underneath the scrubs, a warrior who had traded one kind of battlefield for another, and who had finally stopped apologizing for the fact that she was better at saving lives than she was at being invisible. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint it takes to hold back 17 years' worth of capability and pretend it never existed. Once that restraint broke, once the world knew what she actually was, she discovered something unexpected: the scrubs fit better when everyone knew she was wearing armor underneath. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Did Laura do the right thing when she locked that door and saved a man's life against 20 doctors' recommendations? Or was she right to put a patient's life above her own career? Comment below, and subscribe to see what happens when the system finally meets someone it can't break.